I always thought the night shift would be my penance and my sanctuary, a place where grief could move like a tide that never quite receded, and yet somehow polished the jagged stones of my insides into something that felt almost smooth, where I could pour coffee into mugs already cracked at the lip, and pretend that the steam rising between my face and the customers' faces was a soft curtain I could hide behind, where the highway noise outside the diner's windows was a lullaby of engines and wind and distant thunder, and where the fluorescent lights hummed like anxious bees above my head, as if they were the only heartbeat I needed, until the bell over the door didn't jingle so much as choke, and the man who stepped inside did not bring night with him. He brought a storm. He was soaked through, rainwater trailing from the hem of a black coat that might once have been expensive, and now looked like it had traveled across a battlefield and then a river and then a graveyard. And the way he paused inside the threshold, standing very still, scanning the booths and the counter and the sticky pie case with eyes so dark they reflected nothing, made something old and medically trained inside me snap to attention. Because there is a way the wounded enter a room. A way they hold their breath like a bargain they've struck with pain. A way they choose their next step as if that choice were a secret they would die to protect. And he moved exactly like that. I was wiping down the silver edge of the griddle with a towel that had once been white, and was now the color of weak tea. And I heard myself say the same thing I said to drunks and truckers and men who'd run out of road and courage. "You okay, sir?" Except my voice went soft on the second word, which I hated because softness in my voice always sounded like pleading. And I did not plead anymore. Not for apologies, not for second chances, not for miracles, not since hospitals stopped feeling like temples and started feeling like casinos where the house always won. And he lifted his head in a way that told me he heard both the question and the tremor underneath it. He took 3 uneven steps and reached the counter, and when his hand gripped the metal edge, I saw it. The spill of red blooming beneath his coat like a garden of shadows, the way his fingers left a slick smear as he slid onto the stool. And I didn't scream because screaming is for people who can afford it. People who live in neighborhoods where the police come when you call, and not when they're finished with something else. And besides, there was no time for theatrics, only time for action. And I was moving before the part of my brain that still woke in the night at the memory of monitors flatlining could argue with me. "Don't pass out," I told him, and it came out bossy and calm, the way it always did with patients who were hovering at the edge of that soft black envelope the body wants to slip into. And he gave the smallest, ghost of a smile, a quick slash of mouth like a knife flash, and said, "Not on your floor," in a voice that could have been velvet if it weren't rasping over gravel, and then his eyes lost focus, and I reached over the counter and caught his shoulder to keep him upright, feeling the tremor in his muscles like the shiver of a bridge in a storm. We were alone, thank God or fate or whatever tired angel kept watch over sinners and fools after midnight, because Manny, the cook, had gone out back to smoke and swear at his ex on the phone, and the only couple in the corner booth had left their plates of pancakes to go fight in their car where no one had to watch. So it was just me, and the rain, and the buzzing lights, and this beautiful, ruined stranger trying not to bleed out on the linoleum. And I said, "We need the back." And he nodded once, jaw tightening, and let me guide him off the stool, his weight like a confession against my side, his breath hot and metallic near my cheek, the scent of wet wool and gunpowder and something expensive that didn't belong in my life. Not ever. The supply room behind the kitchen was a mess of cardboard boxes and bulk ketchup and a first aid kit we kept mostly for burns and cut fingers, and I steered him onto an overturned crate, which wasn't ideal but at least put his chest higher than his hips, and I snapped on gloves from the plastic box with the matter-of-fact desperation of a woman who knows that sometimes the difference between life and death is simply whether your hands shake. And as I unbuttoned his coat, I said, because silence can kill quicker than blood loss, "I'm Elena." And he answered, "Because men like him never surrender more than they must. Don't call an ambulance." And I said, not looking at his face because I needed my courage, and his eyes stole it, "I didn't ask your permission." and the corner of his mouth moved again, not quite warm and not quite cruel, and I thought, "Oh, you are not used to being disobeyed." The wound was a through and through, high enough on his left side that I could taste relief like copper on my tongue. The entry was a neat black kiss near the ribs. The exit a ragged second mouth lower. And there was bleeding, but not the catastrophic, pulsing kind that means the hidden things are broken. And as I cut away his shirt with kitchen shears and packed gauze with steady pressure, he went very still and very quiet in the way men try to be when they want to impress a woman with their tolerance for pain. And I wanted to tell him that pain doesn't impress me and never will. That grief taught me the only thing worth applauding is honesty. But instead I said, "This is going to hurt worse," and poured saline. And he made a sound I felt in the roots of my teeth. "Who did this?" I asked, because questions keep people awake and awake is survival. And he said, "Someone who won't do it again," with a certainty that made the room feel smaller, like his promise rearranged the dimensions of walls and air, and I swallowed the argument perched on my tongue and kept working. Because if I've learned anything, it's that the moment you start believing you can change a man is the moment you choose your own disaster. And I was not inviting disaster. I was already hosting it, serving it coffee, binding it with gauze, giving it a seat on a crate like a throne. Up close, his face was confusing. Beautiful the way a storm cell is beautiful when it boils up over flat land, jaw shadowed with a day's neglect. Lashes a surprise against skin the color of old coins, and a scar at his temple that looked like the pale crescent of a bite from the moon. And when I pressed the steri strips into place and taped him tight, I saw the tremor ease in his hands, and for a breath he let his head fall forward, the crown nearly touching my shoulder. And I felt the weight of him like an answer to a question I hadn't let myself ask for years, which was simply this: what would it feel like to be necessary again? I told him to breathe slow, and he did. Following my count as if obeying me came naturally, as if discipline were a language he spoke better than mercy, and then his palm found the concrete floor, and he pushed to standing with a grace that made me think of knives and ballroom floors and the hush inside a cathedral. And I said, because I needed some barrier between his body and mine, "You should rest." And he said, because he understood boundaries and how to slide past them, "I can't be found here." And the words landed between us like a dropped plate. Because of course he couldn't. Of course the kind of trouble that wore clothes like that and smelled like gunfire and salt and money would carry trouble behind it like a comet's tail. "Then you're leaving," I said. And I hated how it sounded like a question. And he studied me the way a drowning man studies the surface. And he said very quietly, "You'll be safe." Which was not a statement I believed from anyone's mouth, and certainly not from his. But somehow, absurdly, I did not laugh. I found an old black hoodie in the lost and found bin, the kind with shredded cuffs and a logo from a high school that closed the year I graduated mine, and helped him slide it on. And when he winced, I heard the echo of other men I had helped, men who lived and men who did not. And I wondered what it meant that my hands remembered how to comfort, while my heart remembered how to brace. And as he tucked a small pistol, God help me, a pistol, into the waistband of his dark jeans, I said, "If anyone asks, I haven't seen you." And he said, with a gravity that made my bones feel like instruments, "If anyone asks, no one will ask." And I understood in that instant that we were speaking two different dialects of the same language. Mine built out of fear and survival, and the slow stitching of daylight back onto a life. His hammered from metal and power, and the narrow mercy of men who do not miss. He moved toward the back door and I followed, because I wanted to lock it behind him, and because I wanted, God help me, to know if he would turn and look at me one more time, to know if I was a person to him or only a pair of competent hands. And at the threshold he did turn, the rain light slanting past his shoulder like silver wire, and he reached for me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat of him like a secret. And he said, "Angel," in a tone that made the word sound less like a pet name and more like a warning. And then he stepped into the rain, and he was gone. I stood there for a long moment after the door clicked shut, listening to the rain erase his footsteps and the highway carry away the news of him. And I wanted to shake, to cry, to laugh at my own predictably reckless heart. But I did none of that. I cleaned the room. I peeled off my gloves. I washed my hands until the skin stung. I scrubbed the smear of his blood from the counter with bleach, and then again with hot soapy water, and then again with the kind of ferocity that has nothing to do with germs and everything to do with absolution. And when Manny came back smelling like cheap tobacco and anger, I told him to flip the sign to closed because the weather was getting worse, and the parking lot was a mirror of black glass. By the time I trudged home through the slick dark, the diner's neon buzzing in my bones like a remembered prayer, I had nearly convinced myself that the whole thing was a fever dream, a story my tired brain had cooked up to make the night feel less endless. And then I set my keys on my kitchen counter and saw it. The small black ring near the sink as out of place as a shard of night on a breakfast plate, heavy and cold when I picked it up. Its surface etched with a serpent coiled around its own tail. And I knew two things at once with a certainty that made the back of my neck prickle. First, that it had not been there when I left for work. And second, that he had not been bleeding as badly as I feared because men who are dying do not leave calling cards. I should have dropped it into the garbage disposal and flipped the switch. Should have ground that snake to dust and walked away and never told a soul. Should have locked my doors and my mouth and my heart. But instead I carried the ring to the table and sat down as if I were preparing to negotiate with a god. And I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the ridges of the serpent's scales bite lightly into my skin like a promise. And I wondered if the word he'd used at the door, angel, was a benediction or a brand. And I told myself I would take it to the police in the morning, even though I already knew I would not, because the police would ask questions I didn't want to answer and make promises they couldn't keep. And because something in me that had been sleeping since the worst day of my life was waking, stretching, opening an eye, and I was terrified of what it would want. Sleep was impossible, which wasn't new. But that night the impossibility had teeth. And when it finally came, it was a thin, glassy version of rest that cracked at every sound. I dreamed of water and sirens and jaws, of knives wrapped in napkins and rain that tasted like iron. And when the alarm on my phone chimed the pale blue hour before dawn, I got up and made coffee. I didn't drink and stared at the ring in the middle of the table like it might start speaking. And all the while, beyond my window, the town yawned into its day as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if a man had not walked into my life and bled himself into the fabric of it like dye. I left for the diner just after sunrise, the sky the color of a bruise spreading, and I paused at my front door with my hand on the deadbolt, the ring cold and secret in my pocket. And I told myself I was overreacting because that is what women tell themselves to survive the moments when their instincts start screaming, to smooth the edges of danger with reason, to make the world polite again. And then I stepped outside, and the morning air kissed my throat, and I looked up. And for a long, suspended beat, I forgot how to breathe, because the street beyond my walkway was no longer empty. Not quiet. Not mine. It was a chamber loaded with intention. Black cars idling like animals with their engines purring. Men standing very still in dark coats with hands at their sides and eyes that did not reflect anything. And in the center of the road, facing my house as if it were a throne room, was a single figure whose posture wrote the word power in the air. I hadn't known his name, not yet. But in that frozen breath I understood that my life had already divided itself into before and after. That I had crossed a threshold in a supply room that smelled of bleach and fear and something like fate. And that I was not the only one who had woken in the night, thinking of a ring and a wound, and a word spoken like a brand. And as the man in the center lifted his hand, not to threaten but to summon, the serpent in my pocket pressed cold teeth into my palm, and I realized with a clarity that made me dizzy that whatever I had bound last night, the skin, the bleeding, the breath, had only stitched shut the first of many things that were about to tear open, and that the next heartbeat would decide whether I ran, or opened my door, or learned the real price of saving a stranger. When I was a little girl, my mother used to tell me that silence was safer than noise, that when the world went still it was because something was listening, something that could not be seen but always waited for the right sound to move. And as I stood barefoot in the doorway of my house with the taste of coffee still bitter on my tongue and my pulse hammering too loudly in my ears, I understood, with a clarity that went bone deep, exactly what she meant, because the world outside was utterly silent. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full of power, full of breath, full of the hum of engines idling in perfect sync, full of men who did not speak because they did not need to. There were so many of them. Rows of black cars gleaming like beetles under the weak morning light. Polished bodies catching the dawn and throwing it back in shards. Windows tinted so dark I could see my own reflection staring back. Pale and unsteady. A ghost framed in her own doorway. Around those cars stood men in suits that fit like armor, every one of them still. Hands clasped or tucked inside coats that no doubt hid guns. Their faces unreadable masks of obedience. They filled the street like a tide that had come in without sound, stretching to the corner and beyond, hundreds, maybe 200, maybe more. I couldn't count because my mind refused to. And at the center of them, not behind anyone, not surrounded though he was the nucleus of their formation, stood the man from the diner, the stranger I had bandaged and thought I'd saved, his body straight and precise as a blade, his dark hair now dry and combed back, his shirt pressed, his coat immaculate, not a trace of weakness left anywhere on him, as though the blood I had wiped from his skin had never existed at all, as though he had been reborn from that wound into something far more dangerous. He looked up at me, and the men behind him shifted ever so slightly, not forward, not yet, but enough for me to feel the ripple of discipline that connected them, as if they all breathed through the same set of lungs. And I realized he hadn't come alone because he couldn't. Not because he needed protection, but because power never walks unaccompanied. "Elena," he said. And my name left his lips like it already belonged to him, not loud but carrying, the sound sliding over the air and finding me easily, settling into my chest where it didn't belong. "Come outside." I should have run back inside, locked the door, called the police, something logical, something normal. But logic was a foreign language in that moment because my body had already gone traitor, my feet frozen to the wood, my heartbeat jerking between fear and fascination. "What do you want?" I called, though my voice cracked on the last word, which humiliated me because I hated sounding small. He took a step closer, and his men shifted again, a wave following its moon, and then he raised one gloved hand just slightly and they stilled, statues once more. "To thank you," he said simply, as if this entire spectacle, this army, this street of power and threat, were merely courtesy. "People usually just send flowers," I said, though my attempt at sarcasm tasted brittle, and his mouth twitched into something like amusement. Though it was darker, sharper, more dangerous than humor had any right to be. "Would you prefer flowers?" he asked, his tone patient but with an edge beneath it that made me think he wasn't accustomed to being refused. "I'd prefer you tell your army to get off my street before the neighbors think I've started a war," I said, crossing my arms, because the act of holding myself felt like control, though it wasn't. Something flickered in his eyes, admiration maybe, or surprise, and then he nodded once and the gesture was echoed down the line. Men stepping back, engines humming lower, the movement orchestrated like a single breath. "Better?" he asked. "No," I said before I could stop myself, "because you're still here." That made him smile, an actual smile this time, though it didn't soften him. "You have courage, Elena." "It's not courage," I said. "It's exhaustion. You terrify me and I haven't had breakfast." He laughed then, softly, almost gently, and I hated that the sound of it made something twist in my stomach, because it wasn't cruel. It was real, unguarded, the kind of laugh that feels like a secret offered, and I didn't want to be offered anything by this man. "You helped me when you should have called the police," he said. "You saw blood and you stayed. Most people run from the sight of it." "Most people don't stumble into my diner half dead," I said, and he inclined his head slightly, conceding. "I owe you a debt," he said, stepping closer again, and this time he didn't stop. He walked until he was at the foot of my porch, until I could see the faint shadow of the scar near his temple, until I could smell the faint cologne that clung to him. Something dark, wood and smoke and a hint of rain. The scent of danger disguised as temptation. "And I repay my debts." "I didn't ask for repayment," I said, though my voice was quieter now, because his presence pressed against me like gravity, because I could feel the pull of him even through the space between us. "You will," he said softly, like a promise rather than a threat. Behind him, one of the men, a tall one with a jaw like cut stone, stepped forward and handed him something small. Adrian held it out to me, palm open. It was the ring. The same black ring with the serpent coiled in eternal hunger. The one I had found on my counter last night. The one that had sat heavy in my pocket all morning. "You kept this," he said. "You left it," I answered. "I don't leave things behind," he said, and there was a meaning there that had nothing to do with jewelry. Not without reason. The way he looked at me made me feel like that reason might be me, which was absurd, which was terrifying, which was somehow worse than all the cars and the men and the guns, because it meant that I wasn't invisible anymore. "Who are you?" I asked, though the question felt too small for the weight it carried. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the pause of someone who chooses his words like weapons, and then he said, "My name is Adrian Moretti." The name hit like thunder, wrapped in silk, familiar in the way all dangerous legends are familiar. I'd heard it whispered in half a dozen versions from the mouths of cops and bartenders and nurses during late-night shifts. The ghost story people told about the man who controlled half the city from the shadows, whose money built hospitals and burned them down in the same year, whose enemies disappeared like dew. The kind of man whose name was more warning than identity. "I don't believe you," I said, because belief made it real, and he smiled again, slow, deliberate, as though my denial were predictable. "You will," he said. And then, as if to underline his words, one of the men spoke quietly into an earpiece, and a moment later, from somewhere down the street, another black car pulled up, sleek and silent. The door opened, and out stepped two men dragging someone between them. A man in a cheap leather jacket, bruised, blood at his mouth. Adrian didn't look at the scene as he said, "This man followed you home last night. One of the Russians. My men found him at the corner." I blinked, my mouth going dry. "Russians?" He turned his head slightly, eyes catching mine. "They would have killed you to find me." I looked at the man, half-conscious, muttering something that might have been a curse, and a chill ran through me. "You brought him here?" "I wanted you to understand what kind of danger you're in," he said. "Saving me made you part of a story you don't know yet." My knees weakened, the world tilting just slightly. I didn't ask to be part of anything. "Neither did I," he said quietly, and something in his voice, softer now, older, almost human, made my anger falter. He lifted his hand again, and the men dragged the captive away, vanishing as if swallowed by the waiting cars. When the engines purred to life again, the air filled with the faint smell of fuel and power and inevitability, and I realized that none of this could be undone. Adrian looked back at me, expression unreadable. "You'll come with me," he said, not a question but an instruction. "I won't," I said immediately, too fast, too sharp. His eyes darkened, Not with anger, but with something else. An ancient sort of patience, as if he'd seen defiance 1,000 times and always knew how it ended. If you stay here, they will find you. They already know your name, your face, where you live. You're not safe alone. I'm not safe with you either, I whispered. He stepped up onto the first stair, his presence a quiet invasion, his shadow mingling with mine. Maybe not, he said, but I don't intend to let you die for what you did. I wanted to tell him that I didn't need saving, that I had been saving myself for years, patching the holes the world left in me, working in a diner where the biggest threat was boredom. But the words didn't come, because some part of me already knew that my life, quiet and small as it was, had ended the moment I put my hands on his skin. His voice softened then, low enough that only I could hear it. Get your things, Elena. The way he said my name made it sound like inevitability, like fate had already signed my consent for me. I'm not going anywhere with you, I said, but the conviction in my tone didn't match the tremor beneath it. He leaned closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath near my ear, and said, You don't understand yet. You saved the devil's life. That means the devil owes you everything, and everything in my world has a price. I didn't move. Couldn't. My pulse was a drum in my throat, my body caught between running and falling. Then he turned, motioning to his men, and they began to disperse, silent again, cars peeling away one by one until only his remained, the air thick with exhaust and unspoken things. He looked over his shoulder at me, his expression unreadable, and said, You have 1 hour before this street is no longer safe. Decide what kind of woman you want to be, Elena. The one who runs or the one who survives. Then he climbed into the car, the door shutting with a sound like the end of a sentence, and the convoy rolled away, leaving the street empty. The silence back again, but changed. Heavier. Haunted. I stood there long after the last engine faded, staring at the space he'd occupied, the serpent ring still cold in my palm, and I realized that the world I'd built out of coffee and routine and denial had cracked wide open. When I finally looked down at my hand, I noticed something new. Carved into the inside of the ring's band was a single word I hadn't seen before, small but precise, engraved deep enough that I could feel it against my skin. It wasn't a name. It was a date. Tomorrow's date. And that was when I understood, with a clarity that chilled me to the marrow, that Adrian Moretti hadn't come to thank me. He had come to claim me. When dawn stretched itself thin across the horizon and turned the edges of my curtains gold, I was still sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where, only a day ago, I had eaten a slice of burnt toast and thought my life was predictable in the small, manageable way that felt like safety. And now, there was a black ring lying between my fingers, gleaming dully under the weak light. A serpent biting its own tail. An endless circle of promise and punishment. And I was tracing the engraved date on its inner curve like it was a countdown carved into fate itself. A number that pulsed beneath my thumb like a warning I couldn't read fast enough to obey. I hadn't slept. Not even for a minute. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the convoy of black cars. The silent men standing in military precision. The way Adrian Moretti's gaze had held mine like he could rewrite the rules of my heartbeat. And beneath all of that, the trembling realization that the quiet world I'd built had never really been safe. It had only been ignored. And now that I'd stepped into his orbit, I had been seen, marked, chosen, and the idea of that recognition filled me with equal parts dread and something else I didn't want to name. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, untouched, but I kept lifting it to my lips out of habit, because pretending to do something ordinary was the only way to anchor myself in a morning that felt like it belonged to someone else. And the street outside, though empty now, hummed with a residue of last night's chaos, as if the air itself remembered the weight of the cars and the discipline of the men who'd stood there waiting for one command, from a man whose voice didn't need to rise to be obeyed. Every part of me screamed to run, to pack a bag, to drive until the gas ran out, to disappear into some nameless town where no one looked twice at a stranger. But another part, smaller and quieter, and far more dangerous, whispered that running would be useless, because men like Adrian didn't lose things. They retrieved them, and because he had said I wasn't safe here, and I believed him, even though I didn't want to, even though everything I'd ever learned about survival told me not to trust the man who made the threat sound like a vow. By the time the clock on the wall stuttered toward 9, I had made 3 lists in my head. One of the things I couldn't leave behind, one of the places I might hide, and one of the regrets I already carried like bruises under my skin. And the last list was the longest, because it included everything from answering the door to ever learning how to stitch wounds. It was almost a relief when the knock came. Not loud, not frantic, just a measured, deliberate rhythm against the wood, polite in its inevitability. I didn't have to ask who it was, because politeness delivered with that kind of precision only belonged to one world, and I had seen its face yesterday, lined up in black suits under a pale sky. When I opened the door, it wasn't Adrian. It was one of his men, tall and unbending, the kind of man who looked carved rather than born, his expression unreadable but his purpose sharp. "Miss Rossi," he said, his voice smooth and accented, and I wondered if they had researched me enough to know that hearing my name like that, wrapped in foreign edges, made my pulse quicken for reasons I didn't understand. "Mr. Moretti sent me." "Of course he did," I said, leaning against the doorframe to keep from swaying. "What does he want?" "To ensure your safety," he said, without irony, as if the words themselves were not the definition of absurdity, as if being watched by an army was the same thing as being protected. "I told him I'm not going anywhere," I said, though my voice betrayed the fact that I hadn't actually told him anything. He had told me. The man inclined his head slightly. "Mr. Moretti anticipated you'd say that." He gestured toward the street, and when I followed his gaze, I saw another car waiting, smaller this time, unmarked, but unmistakably one of theirs. "He requests your company. He insists you'll want to hear what he has to say." There are moments in life where choice becomes illusion, where saying no doesn't actually stop the thing from happening, it just changes the method of its arrival. And I knew that standing there in the doorway, barefoot and hollow-eyed, because I could feel it in the air around me, the inevitability, the quiet choreography of power that had already decided the outcome. I could have slammed the door, called the police, screamed, done all the things people do when they think the world still follows rules. But I didn't. Because deep down, beneath the fear, there was a gnawing, treacherous curiosity, a need to understand the man who had turned my life inside out in a single night, the man whose name could silence a street, the man who had called me angel like it was both a compliment and a curse. So I said, "Give me a minute." And the man nodded once, waiting outside as I went back inside to grab my jacket, my phone, and the ring, which I slipped onto a chain and hid under my shirt, because something told me that it belonged to me now, whether I wanted it or not. The ride was quiet. The man, his name, I later learned, was Luca, drove with the kind of focus that belonged to soldiers, eyes forward, hands steady, the city sliding by in a blur of gray and light, and I watched it through the tinted window, feeling like I was being carried deeper into a world that had always existed just beneath the surface of mine, invisible until it decided to look back. We left the familiar streets behind, trading small-town sameness for the sleek sprawl of the city, glass and steel and wealth rising like monuments to human arrogance. And when the car finally turned into a gated drive guarded by more men in suits, my stomach twisted, because I understood where we were going before Luca said it. The Moretti estate. The gates opened without a sound, and what waited beyond them didn't look like a house so much as a fortress disguised as elegance. A mansion of pale stone and dark windows, sprawling gardens that were too manicured to be natural, fountains that whispered instead of splashed. Everything about it spoke of control, of a man who allowed beauty only when it served his purpose. When the car stopped, Luca got out and opened my door, his hand extended not out of courtesy but expectation, and when my feet hit the cobblestones, I felt the shift in the air, the quiet hum of surveillance, the faint scent of rain still clinging to the morning. Adrian was waiting at the top of the stairs. He wasn't dressed like the wounded man I'd bandaged. Now he wore a charcoal suit and an expression that could have been carved from patience itself, his hair gleaming like ink under the light. And the moment his eyes found me, something sharp and invisible caught in my chest. "Thank you for coming," he said, as if I'd had a choice. "I didn't," I replied, climbing the stairs slowly, each step a negotiation between defiance and the strange pull he exerted just by existing. "You sent your soldier to fetch me." His lips curved faintly, that almost smile again. "You're here, aren't you? That's what matters." The mansion swallowed me whole. Inside, it was all shadows and glass, and the faint echo of footsteps on marble. The air thick with the scent of leather, smoke, and something expensive I couldn't name. Paintings lined the walls, dark, dramatic things full of violence disguised as art. And in the center of the grand room stood a massive piano, its black surface gleaming like still water. He gestured toward a seat near the window, and I sat because refusing felt childish, because standing made me too aware of the way his gaze followed me. "You said I wasn't safe," I began, and he nodded, folding his hands behind his back. "You're not," he said simply. "The people who shot me, they saw your face. They think you know something you don't." "And what do they think I know?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then said, "They think you have the ring." My breath caught. "They're right." He nodded slowly, stepping closer until I could feel the weight of him in the space between us. "That ring holds more than metal. It holds information, names, accounts, the skeleton of an empire that half this city pretends doesn't exist. When you picked it up, you became a liability to every man who wants what I have." I wanted to laugh, to tell him how absurd it was, how ordinary I was, how the universe must have made some cosmic error in choosing me. But the look in his eyes silenced the impulse. "So what happens now?" I asked, though the answer trembled on the edge of my thoughts. He walked to the window, looking out at the rain that had started again, fine and relentless, and said, "Now you stay here, under my protection." I shook my head. "I'm not a possession." "No," he said softly, turning back to me. "You're a target. That's worse." There was no drama in his tone, no attempt to frighten me, just the plain, unvarnished truth of a man who knew the cost of his world. I wanted to argue, to tell him I could take care of myself, that I didn't need a man with an army to save me. But the memory of the bruised man from yesterday, dragged and broken and dangerous, rose up behind my words, and they died in my throat. He took a slow step toward me, his presence filling the room, his voice a low murmur. "You saved my life, Elena. Now it's my turn to save yours." And before I could reply, before I could remind him that I hadn't asked for salvation, he reached into his pocket and set a phone on the table beside me. "You can use this to call anyone you want," he said. "But if you leave this house, I can't promise you'll survive the night." The air between us felt charged, heavy with things neither of us wanted to say aloud, and as he turned to leave the room, his voice drifted back to me, soft but final. "You have no idea what kind of storm you walked into, Angel." He disappeared down the corridor, leaving me alone with the faint hum of rain against the windows, and the ring that felt heavier now than it ever had before, and I sat there staring at it, at the tiny serpent biting its tail, realizing that the man I had saved was not just a monster, but the kind of monster who could make you forget he had teeth until he smiled. And somewhere outside, beyond the walls and the gates, and the illusion of safety, I heard the distant echo of engines, cars pulling up again, tires whispering on wet stone, and I knew with cold certainty that whatever Adrian was protecting me from had already found me. The walls of Adrian Moretti's mansion didn't feel like walls at all. Not really. They felt like ribs, like the bones of some enormous creature that had swallowed me whole. And now I was trapped inside its chest, listening to the slow, patient heartbeat of something that never slept, never softened, never stopped watching. Every sound in that house had its own kind of echo. The click of shoes against marble, the whisper of silk curtains as they moved with the breeze, the low hum of distant voices that always went silent the moment I stepped into a hallway. There was no true silence here, only the illusion of it, stretched thin over the thrum of security cameras, of men murmuring into earpieces, of the quiet discipline of a world built on vigilance and control. I had been inside less than 24 hours, but it already felt longer, as if time itself had been persuaded to behave differently here, as if every second slowed to the rhythm of Adrian's command. He had told me to rest, to make myself at home, to trust that no one would harm me under his roof, which was such a carefully constructed promise that it made my skin crawl. It wasn't the words that unsettled me, it was the certainty behind them, the effortless way he spoke like a man who had never been contradicted by the world, who had never asked for permission to breathe. They gave me a room on the second floor, and when I say gave, what I mean is that Luca escorted me there, opened the door and said, "This is yours for now," before disappearing down the hall without another word, leaving me to stand in the middle of a space that looked like it had been curated from a magazine meant for someone else's life. The bed was enormous, draped in white sheets so soft they looked like spilled milk. The window overlooked the gardens, where I could see men walking the perimeter like clock hands, always turning, always aligned. There were fresh flowers on the nightstand, lilies, white and fragrant, their scent so thick it was almost oppressive, and on the dresser, a folded note in careful handwriting that simply read, "Dinner at 8." I wanted to crumple it, to throw it away, to scream that I wasn't a guest but a hostage dressed in courtesy. But my anger was too thin to carry me anywhere. Instead, I sat on the bed, stared at the window, and tried to convince myself that this was temporary, that I could survive whatever this was if I stayed quiet, stayed cautious, stayed small. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that the house itself didn't allow smallness. Everything about it was built to remind you of power. The ceilings that rose too high. The mirrors that reflected you smaller than you were. The art that looked back at you with judgment. By the time 8 came, I had changed clothes twice. Not because I wanted to impress him, but because every outfit I owned looked wrong in this place. My jeans and work shirt looked like rebellion. My plain black dress looked like surrender. In the end, I chose something neutral, something forgettable, though the truth was that nothing about me felt neutral anymore. Dinner wasn't dinner, it was theater. The dining room was long enough to hold echoes, and at its center, a table that gleamed like dark water. Adrian sat at one end, surrounded by soft light from a chandelier that dripped crystals like frozen tears. His men stood along the walls, silent and alert, their eyes forward but always watching. When I entered, he rose, not out of politeness, I think, but because it was part of the choreography of control, and gestured to the chair opposite his. "Please," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. "Sit." I did, because I was too tired not to, and because there was something in his tone that wasn't a command so much as inevitability. "You haven't eaten all day," he said, as if he had been keeping track, and maybe he had. "You should eat." The food was beautiful in that careful, deliberate way that made me uneasy. Grilled sea bass, roasted vegetables, wine poured before I could refuse it. My hands trembled when I lifted the fork, and I hated that he noticed. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said quietly, and it would have been easier to believe him if the room hadn't been full of men with guns. "I'm not afraid," I lied, because admitting fear to a man like Adrian felt like an invitation. His mouth curved slightly, not into a smile, but something that lived in the space between amusement and pity. "You should be." I looked up at him, at the careful stillness of his face, and asked, "Is that a threat?" "No," he said, setting his glass down. "It's a fact." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint clink of silverware, the soft rhythm of rain starting again against the tall windows. He watched me like he was memorizing something he didn't yet understand. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but it carried weight. "You remind me of someone." I wasn't sure I wanted to ask who, but curiosity was my most dangerous flaw. "Who?" He hesitated, looking down at his glass, and then said, "Someone who thought she could fix what was broken in me." His eyes lifted to mine again, dark and endless. She was wrong. The words hit me harder than I expected, because they sounded less like warning and more like confession, and before I could stop myself, I asked, "What happened to her?" He didn't look away this time. "She died." There was no emotion in his tone, no grief, no guilt, just a hollow kind of acceptance that made my skin tighten. I didn't ask how. I didn't need to. Men like him didn't lose women to coincidence. When the plates were cleared, he poured more wine and said, "You're not a prisoner, Elena. You can walk the grounds, go where you like, within reason. But if you try to leave, you'll be followed, not because I wish it, but because it's necessary. Understand that I'm not your enemy." "I don't even know what you are," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "Then let me show you." And that was how I found myself walking beside him through the long corridors of his home, past doors that stayed locked, past rooms that smelled of secrets. He led me into a smaller chamber, a study, lined with books and photographs, a heavy desk at its center. On the wall behind it hung a single framed picture, a younger Adrian, flanked by two other men, all three in suits, their smiles thin and cold. He stopped before the photo, his gaze fixed on the man standing beside him. "Marco," he said, almost to himself. "My brother." I turned to him, recognizing the name instantly from the whispers I'd heard earlier. The betrayal, the bullet wound that had nearly killed him, the reason I'd found him bleeding in my diner. "He's the one who tried to kill you." Adrian nodded slowly. "He's also the one who taught me everything I know about loyalty." He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "Which is why his betrayal isn't just business, it's personal." There was a stillness to his words, the kind that only comes from someone who has rehearsed revenge until it becomes prayer. I should have been horrified. I should have told him I didn't want to know any of this, that I didn't belong in his world of blood debts and quiet wars. But instead, I found myself asking, "And what happens to people who betray you?" He didn't hesitate. They cease to exist. The simplicity of it chilled me more than any threat could. When he turned to face me fully, the distance between us seemed to collapse. "You think I'm a monster?" he said softly, almost like he was daring me to deny it. "I think you're dangerous," I answered. He stepped closer, until his breath brushed my cheek. "And you? You stitched a bullet wound and didn't flinch. You didn't scream, didn't run. Dangerous recognizes dangerous?" The words sank into me like heat and poison all at once. I wanted to step back, to reclaim space, but the air between us was charged, magnetic, and instead I whispered, "You mistake survival for strength." "Maybe," he said, "but you're still here, aren't you?" He reached up, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the weight of his intention. I don't know yet if you were the best mistake of my life or the most fatal one." The lights flickered then, a quick pulse that broke whatever spell had been winding between us, and a second later, the door burst open. Luca appeared, his calm facade gone. "Boss?" he said quickly. "We have movement on the perimeter. Russian vehicles, at least 3. Adrian's expression hardened instantly, the softness gone like smoke. "Lock down the gates," he ordered. "Get everyone in position." Luca nodded and disappeared. I stood frozen as the air changed. Gone was the quiet luxury, replaced by the electric hum of danger. Adrian turned to me, his eyes sharp. "Stay here. Don't move." But before I could even form the word wait, he was already gone, his footsteps echoing down the hall, swallowed by the sound of men shouting orders. Through the window, I could see flashes of movement. Dark shapes converging, lights cutting through the rain, the metallic glint of guns raised and ready. And then, through the storm and the chaos, a single explosion shattered the night, the sound so violent it felt like the world itself had cracked open. The windows trembled, the power surged and died, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps approaching. Soft and deliberate. Not Adrian's, not anyone's I recognized. And when I turned toward the door, I saw the faint outline of a man standing there, a gun glinting in his hand. He smiled, a slow, mocking curve of lips, and said, in a voice laced with familiarity, "You must be the woman who saved my brother." And that was when I knew. Marco Moretti had found me. The sound of my own heartbeat was so loud it seemed to fill the room, drumming against the inside of my ribs like it was trying to break free. And yet everything else around me felt strangely muffled, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton, and all the edges had gone soft, unreal, suspended in that thin sliver of time that exists between the moment you recognize danger and the moment it devours you. The man standing in the doorway, Adrian's mirror in every line of his face but sharper, colder, his smile a scalpel rather than a shadow, didn't need to introduce himself because I knew immediately, not through logic but through instinct, that this was the brother, the betrayal, the ghost that had been haunting Adrian's edges since the night he bled on my diner floor. Marco Moretti didn't just walk into rooms, he infected them. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, the gun hanging loose at his side like it was an extension of his body. And the rain outside seemed to pause midair as if even the storm understood it wasn't in control anymore. "Don't scream," he said, his voice smooth and disturbingly soft. The kind of voice people might trust right up until they saw the blood on his hands. "I don't like noise." "I wasn't planning to," I said, though my throat felt like glass, and he smiled again. Something lazy and cruel that told me he enjoyed seeing me struggle to hold on to my composure. "Good," he said, moving closer. "You're prettier when you're quiet." He stopped in front of me, and the scent that clung to him was all smoke and iron and expensive sin. Up close, he looked nothing like the man I'd met before, and yet too much like him at the same time. The same eyes, but without mercy. The same mouth, but curved in mockery instead of command. If Adrian was control carved into flesh, Marco was chaos wearing it like perfume. "Where is he?" I asked before I could stop myself, because if I didn't keep talking, I was going to drown in the silence between us. His grin widened. "Worried already? That's sweet. You really think he's coming for you?" "He always does," I said, hating how it sounded like a confession. He tilted his head, studying me like a scientist studying a specimen that shouldn't exist. "He told me about you, you know. The little nurse who thought she could fix the world with a bandage and a steady hand. You should have let him bleed out, sweetheart. You'd still have a quiet life if you had." "I didn't do it for him," I said, and he chuckled, a low, mocking sound that scraped along my nerves. "No," he said. "You did it because you're one of those rare creatures who think saving something broken makes it yours. That's what he saw in you. He's always been drawn to purity he can corrupt. The words stung because they carried too much truth, and he must have seen it in my face because he leaned closer, his breath warm near my cheek, and whispered, "He'll ruin you, Elena." That's what he does. He turns everything he touches into a weapon or a memory. I wanted to tell him that Adrian wasn't the monster he was painting, but I couldn't, because I didn't know. All I knew was the way Adrian had looked at me. Not like prey, but like something dangerous enough to understand him. And the way he had said my name, low and reverent, like a man praying to the thing that might destroy him. "What do you want from me?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady, because fear made predators hungrier, and I could tell this man fed on it. He smiled again, but this time it was different, sharper. "Information," he said simply. "You have something that belongs to me." It took me a heartbeat to realize what he meant, and then my hand went instinctively to the chain beneath my shirt, fingers closing around the cold shape of the serpent ring. His eyes followed the motion, and that was all the confirmation he needed. "I should have known he'd leave it with you," Marco said, almost to himself. "Always sentimental, my brother. Always stupid." "It's just a ring," I lied, but my voice betrayed me. He laughed softly. "Oh no, little angel. It's never just a ring." Before I could react, he moved, a blur of motion too quick for thought, and his hand closed around my wrist, yanking me forward hard enough to make the chain snap, the ring falling into his palm with a metallic chime that sounded too much like defeat. His grip was firm, not cruel yet, but I could feel the strength behind it, restrained the way a cat restrains a bird just before deciding what to do next. "Now," he said, holding the ring up to the light. "This is interesting." He turned it between his fingers, his expression one of fascination, as if he was studying something precious and cursed. He always did have a flair for the dramatic. "I assume he hasn't told you what's hidden in here?" I stayed silent, because silence was all I had left to use as armor. "Of course not," Marco said, tucking the ring into his pocket. "He likes to keep his toys ignorant, makes them easier to control." He stepped closer again, and this time I could feel the chill of the gun barrel when he lifted it, tracing the metal down my jaw with a gentleness that was somehow worse than violence. "But don't worry, I'm not going to kill you yet. You're far too useful for that. You're going to help me bring him to me." "I won't," I said, even though I had no plan, no leverage, nothing but defiance to hurl at him. "Oh, I think you will," he said, his voice almost tender. "Because when my brother's heart is involved, he's predictable. And right now, you're the only thing that makes it beat faster." The air seemed to thicken around us, and then, from somewhere beyond the door, the sound of footsteps, fast, purposeful, echoing against the marble floors. Marco's eyes flicked toward the hallway, and the grin that curved his mouth was pure anticipation. "Speak of the devil," he murmured. The door burst open, and there he was, Adrian, his expression a mask of fury so quiet it was almost holy, his gun raised, his men flooding in behind him like a wave of precision. The room exploded into motion. "Marco," Adrian said, voice low and even, the calm before the kill. "Let her go." "Always so noble," Marco replied, tightening his grip on my arm. "Tell me, brother, how many times are you going to risk everything for something that doesn't belong to you?" "I don't risk," Adrian said, his tone soft but lethal. "I decide." Their eyes locked, and for a moment the space between them felt alive, humming with history, betrayal, and something that might have once been love. They looked like two halves of the same sin, carved from the same marble and set on opposite altars. Then, without warning, Marco shoved me toward Adrian and fired. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap inside my skull. I hit the ground hard, the world spinning in slow motion, glass shattering, men shouting. Adrian dropped beside me, one arm around me, the other steadying his gun. He fired twice, precise and cold, and Marco staggered backward, blood blooming bright against his shirt, before he disappeared into the smoke and chaos. When the noise died, there was only the sound of my ragged breathing and Adrian's hand gripping my shoulder, grounding me back into reality. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice raw, stripped of all the authority it usually carried. I shook my head, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "He took the ring." "I know," Adrian said, his eyes narrowing, something dangerous flashing behind them. "And he won't get far." He stood, offering me his hand, and for a moment I hesitated before taking it. His palm was warm, steady, and when I rose, his gaze met mine. Not the cold mask of a man in control, but the flicker of something unguarded, something that made my chest tighten. "I told you not to leave the room," he said, his tone soft but laced with frustration. "I didn't exactly have a choice," I replied, my voice shaking with anger and adrenaline. "Your brother broke in." His jaw clenched. "He won't again." I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the conviction in his voice could hold back whatever storm was coming. But when I looked out the window and saw the faint red glow of fire in the distance, Marco's men retreating, regrouping, not gone, I knew that this was far from over. "Why didn't you kill him?" I asked. Adrian's eyes darkened. "Because he's my brother. And that still matters?" His silence was answer enough. The rest of the night blurred into motion, guards shouting orders, lights flickering back to life, the metallic tang of smoke and blood clinging to the air. Adrian moved through it all with terrifying calm, issuing commands, checking perimeters, restoring order, until finally, when the last of the chaos had quieted, he turned back to me. "You can't stay here anymore," he said, voice low. "He knows where you are. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." "And what does he want?" I asked, though I already knew. "You," Adrian said simply, "because taking you from me would hurt more than killing me." The words hit harder than a gunshot, not because of what they meant, but because of the truth inside them, the way they made something inside me crack open. I should have said something, should have told him I didn't want to be anyone's weakness. But before I could, he reached out, his hand brushing my cheek in a touch so fleeting it felt accidental. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You should never have been part of this." And before I could ask what this even was, he turned away, walking toward the window, the faint light of fire painting his silhouette in gold and red. A man caught between salvation and damnation. Outside, the night rumbled with the promise of more violence, and as I watched him, his back straight, his shoulders set, I realized with a shiver that I no longer knew if I wanted him to win or to fall, only that whichever came first would take me with him. There is a kind of stillness that follows violence, a quiet so sharp it feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting to see who will move first. And as dawn crept through the soot-streaked windows of Adrian Moretti's mansion, that stillness pressed against my skin like a second heartbeat, constant, relentless, unignorable. The night had bled itself out in gunfire and smoke, and now everything smelled like aftermath. Spent gunpowder, wet stone, the faint metallic tang of blood hidden beneath the polish of marble floors. I sat at the edge of the bed they'd brought me back to, wearing someone else's oversized shirt, because mine had been torn during the chaos, and I stared at the cracks of pale light crawling across the room, wondering how I had gone from being a woman who bandaged wounds for strangers to one who was now being hunted because she had unknowingly stepped into a world where mercy was a myth. I hadn't seen Adrian since the night erupted into fire and shouting, since he had said those words that were both a warning and a confession. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. I didn't know if that meant the ring, the secrets it carried, or me. Maybe all three. But I did know that whatever had begun the moment I touched that man in the diner had grown into something far larger, far darker, and far more personal than either of us had intended. The house was too quiet. Not peaceful, but the kind of quiet that lives after destruction, when everyone's too tired to speak and too wary to believe the silence will last. Somewhere below, I could hear the low murmur of men's voices, Luca giving orders, footsteps pacing the halls, but it was distant, softened by walls thick enough to keep secrets. I wanted to leave this room, to demand answers, to ask Adrian what I was supposed to do now, but I didn't know if he'd even listen. Men like him didn't explain themselves. They revealed only what they wanted you to see, and they did it so well you mistook it for intimacy. When I finally forced myself to stand, the world tilted slightly beneath my feet, a reminder that adrenaline wears off faster than fear. My reflection in the mirror looked like someone else's face. Pale, eyes hollow, a smear of dried blood near my temple I hadn't noticed before. I wiped it away with the back of my hand, trying not to think about whose blood it was. A soft knock broke the silence, and I turned, startled. The door opened before I could answer, and Luca stepped inside. His expression, as always, was unreadable. Stoic, professional, carved from the same stone as the walls that surrounded us. "Mr. Moretti requests your presence," he said simply. "Requests or orders?" I asked, my voice rough. His gaze flickered briefly, almost a hint of something human. "Does it matter?" I wanted to argue, to tell him that it did matter, that I wasn't one of Adrian's soldiers to be summoned at will. But I didn't. I followed him down the long corridor lined with oil paintings and polished furniture that gleamed like mirrors. The house seemed larger now, endless, each hallway branching into more secrets. We descended the staircase, and the air grew cooler, heavier. The faint echo of the city's rain-soaked wind slipping through cracks in the stone. He led me to the library, a cavernous room filled with books that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. The scent of leather and dust thick in the air. Adrian stood near the window, his back to me, hands clasped behind him, posture precise, deliberate. He didn't turn when I entered. "You didn't tell me your brother was alive," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't move, but his voice came quietly, smooth and low, like the edge of a blade being drawn from its sheath. "You didn't ask. That's not an answer." Now he turned, slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. "No," he said. "It's the truth." I crossed my arms, partly for warmth, partly to keep from shaking. "He was here, Adrian. He could have killed me." "He didn't. That's not the comfort you think it is." He studied me for a long moment, and then his gaze softened, the faintest shift in a face that rarely betrayed emotion. "You shouldn't have been part of this. I told myself that keeping you here would protect you, but I underestimated him. That was my mistake, and it won't happen again." I laughed then, sharp and humorless. "You talk like you can control everything, like the whole world is some chessboard you built yourself. What happens when someone refuses to play your game?" His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered, a shadow passing through the storm. "Then I changed the rules." He moved closer, not menacing, but with a kind of gravity that drew me in, despite every instinct screaming to retreat. "Do you have any idea what that ring actually is, Elena?" "I know it's dangerous," I said. "I know people are dying because of it." "It's more than that," he said quietly. "It's a ledger, encrypted, hidden inside the metal. Names, accounts, transactions. Every man who's ever taken blood money in this city, every politician who ever sold their soul for protection. It's everything. Enough to destroy empires or rebuild them, depending on who holds it." I stared at him, stunned. "And you carried that around like jewelry?" "I carried it," he said, "because it reminded me who I couldn't trust, including my own blood." "Marco," I whispered. He nodded, stepping away, his gaze distant now, drawn to something beyond the glass. We built this together. Years of work, years of loyalty. He wanted it all for himself, so he sold information to the Russians, gave them our roots, our men. He thought he could use the ledger to buy his way into power. And now he's using me to get it back, I said. Yes, Adrian said, turning to face me again. Your leverage. There it was, the word I'd been avoiding, the truth I'd known but hadn't wanted to hear. So what now? I asked. You keep me locked in this house until he comes again? Hope he doesn't shoot me before he shoots you? He shook his head. I'm not keeping you here. I'm taking you somewhere safe. Safe, I repeated, tasting the word like it was foreign. You mean hidden. Call it what you like, he said. But it's necessary. I wanted to tell him no, that I wouldn't let him uproot me again, that I was tired of being moved like a piece on a board I didn't understand. But his tone, his posture, everything about him told me the decision had already been made. You can't protect me from everything, I said finally. He gave a small, tired smile. Maybe not. But I can protect you from him. The way he said it, quiet, unwavering, made something inside me twist. Because I realized then that this wasn't just about vengeance or power or even family. This was personal. This was about guilt. When do we leave? I asked, the resignation heavy in my voice. Tonight, he said. We'll move when the sun goes down. He stepped closer again, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, the faint scent of smoke and rain that always seemed to follow him. You should rest until then. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, where we were going, how far his reach extended, why the sight of him made my heart pound with equal parts fear and fascination. But instead I said, You should too. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment something unguarded flickered behind his composure, something I wasn't supposed to see. I can't, he said simply. I don't sleep well, not anymore. Before I could respond, Luca appeared in the doorway, murmured something in Italian I couldn't catch, and Adrian's attention snapped back to business. The moment between us closed like a door. He nodded to Luca, then back to me. Stay here. Don't talk to anyone. I'll send for you when it's time. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with too many thoughts and not enough answers. As evening bled into night, I stood by the window, watching the last light fade from the horizon, the gardens below glowing faintly under the floodlights. Somewhere beyond those walls, Marco was still out there, moving closer, waiting for the next move. I wondered if Adrian's plan would save us or destroy us, if he could really keep control of something that had already spiraled beyond both of them. When the door opened again hours later, I expected Luca, but it wasn't him. It was a woman. Tall, elegant, dressed in black. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, and she smiled when she saw me, but it wasn't a kind smile. Adrian sent me, she said smoothly, to help you pack. There was something in the way she said his name that made my stomach knot. A familiarity, a history. I didn't catch your name, I said, my hand still resting on the window frame. Isabella, she said, her tone like silk drawn over glass. I used to work for him. Once. Used to. The words lingered like smoke. She moved closer, her perfume filling the air, rich and dark. You must be special, she said. He doesn't bring many people here, and he never hides them. I didn't ask him to, I said. Her smile widened. That's what makes it interesting. She began pulling a suitcase from the closet, her movements precise, too practiced to be harmless. When she turned back, her expression softened, almost pitying. You should be careful, Elena. Adrian saves people, but he doesn't keep them. He breaks them until they forget who they were trying to be. Before I could answer, she pressed something into my hand, a folded piece of paper, and whispered, If you want to survive this, don't get in that car tonight." Then she walked out, closing the door behind her. I unfolded the note, my hands trembling. Scrawled in hurried ink were 3 words that froze my blood. "He already knows." I didn't know if the warning was about Marco or Adrian. There are moments in life when the air itself feels heavier, as if it has learned something terrible before you have, and it's simply waiting for you to catch up, to realize that what you thought was solid ground is nothing more than a bridge built over fire. That was how the night felt as I sat on the edge of the bed with Isabella's note trembling between my fingers, the ink still faintly smudged as if it had been written in haste or fear. And the 3 words "he already knows" burned against my skin like a secret trying to escape. I didn't know who she meant, whether it was Adrian who already knew something about me, or Marco who already knew where I was, but the uncertainty was enough to split my mind in 2. Half of me wanting to run, the other half too paralyzed to move. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that was never natural in a place like this, because silence here meant orchestration, meant that somewhere behind the walls, men were moving with purpose, preparing for something I wasn't supposed to see. Outside the window, the gardens were bathed in silver light, the moon stretching the shadows long across the ground, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw someone down there, a figure dressed in black, standing perfectly still near the iron gates. But when I blinked, the space was empty again, and I couldn't tell if it was real or if paranoia had finally found its voice inside me. I folded the note, hiding it in the pocket of my jeans, though the gesture felt pointless, because if Isabella was right, if he already knows, then there was nothing I could hide that hadn't already been uncovered. My pulse was erratic, my breathing too shallow, and yet I forced myself to stand, to move toward the door, because sitting still felt like surrender. And I had learned long ago that fear grows best in stillness. The handle was cold beneath my fingers, and for one terrible second, I thought it wouldn't turn, that I was locked in like some fragile animal being kept safe, or contained. But it opened with a soft click, and the hallway beyond yawned out before me, dimly lit, lined with shadows that seemed to breathe when I wasn't looking directly at them. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't wait for whatever was coming. My bare feet made no sound on the marble, but the echo of my heartbeat followed me as I moved past the grand staircase, past the portraits, whose painted eyes tracked me with ancient judgment, past a series of closed doors that might have hidden anything. Secrets, weapons, ghosts. The mansion was enormous, but it felt smaller in the dark, as though the walls had drawn closer, pressing in, whispering that every step I took was already accounted for in someone else's plan. I reached the end of the corridor and stopped, listening. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed, soft but deliberate, followed by the sound of low voices. I couldn't make out the words, only the cadence, Adrian's voice, low and controlled, and another, lighter, female. Isabella. The sound of her name in my thoughts made my chest tighten. She had warned me not to get in the car tonight, but now she was with him, and the question of whether she was protecting me or setting me up began to unspool inside my head like a thread I couldn't stop pulling. I crept down the stairs, each step a negotiation between silence and urgency, until I reached the landing that overlooked the foyer. From there I could see them. Adrian standing near the grand doors, his suit immaculate even after the night of violence, his expression unreadable, and Isabella beside him, her posture relaxed, her smile practiced. She was holding something in her hand, a small flash drive, and the way Adrian's gaze lingered on it told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't just a drive, it was a piece of the ledger, the kind of information that could ruin kings and bury empires. "I thought you said it was gone," she was saying, her voice smooth as silk, but threaded with something sharper underneath. "It was," Adrian replied, his tone even. Until you brought me this. She stepped closer to him, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, because there was a familiarity in her movement, in the way her hand brushed. His arm, that spoke of history, of something that had once been intimate and maybe still was. You shouldn't underestimate what people are willing to sell for survival, she murmured, including me. Adrian's lips curved slightly, but there was no warmth in the expression. You always were pragmatic. I learned from the best, she said. And then, after a pause that felt too heavy, she added, Does she know? The shift in his expression was small but unmistakable, like a shadow passing across a flame. Know what? He asked. That you killed her fiancé, Isabella said, her voice soft and cutting all at once, like a confession wrapped in a knife. My breath caught so sharply that for a moment I thought I'd made a sound, but neither of them looked up. The world tilted, my vision narrowing to that one sentence, to the echo of it crashing through my mind like glass shattering. You killed her fiancé? No. No, it couldn't be true. The accident that had taken Michael from me, the car explosion the police had said was a random act of violence, a business dispute gone wrong. That had been years ago, another lifetime. It had nothing to do with this. It couldn't. But the look on Adrian's face as he exhaled, slow, controlled, almost weary, told me otherwise. She doesn't know, he said quietly. Isabella smiled faintly, victory flickering in her eyes. And when she does? She'll hate me, he said without hesitation. And she'll be right to. The air left my lungs all at once, and I stumbled back from the railing, the world spinning in slow motion around me. The marble floor, the chandelier, the dark gleam of Adrian's hair, all of it blurred into a single smear of disbelief. I pressed my hand over my mouth, biting down hard enough to taste blood, desperate to keep from making a sound. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't look at him, not knowing that the man I had saved, the man I had begun, God help me to care for, was the same man who had destroyed my life without even knowing my name. I turned and fled down the hallway, my bare feet slipping on the smooth floor, tears burning behind my eyes. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out. Away. Anywhere that wasn't this house and this truth. But as I rounded the corner, a voice stopped me. Going somewhere, Angel? The nickname that had once sounded like salvation now felt like poison. Adrian stood at the end of the hall, his expression unreadable, though his eyes, those dark, impossible eyes, were shadowed with something that looked almost like regret. How long were you standing there? I demanded, my voice breaking despite myself. Long enough, he said. Then you know what I heard. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. Yes. The word dropped between us like a blade. I trusted you, I said, the words trembling as they left my mouth. I let you protect me. I let you into my life, and all this time. He took a step closer, his voice low, rough around the edges in a way I had never heard before. It wasn't supposed to be you. I didn't know who he was when it happened. It was business, Elena, a message, a deal gone wrong. If I could undo it, I would. Business? I repeated, the word cutting through me like a shard of glass. You call it business when you murder someone's future? His jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek twitching. I didn't say I was proud of it. I've done terrible things, things I'll never wash off. But I don't lie to myself about what I am. I'm trying to make sure no one else dies because of me. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Too late for that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The distance between us felt like a chasm filled with everything unsaid. Grief, rage, the cruel irony of fate. He looked at me as though he wanted to reach for me but knew better. Finally, he said, You need to leave tonight. The car's ready. Luca will take you somewhere safe. You can hate me from there. I don't need your protection. Yes, he said quietly. You do. Because Marco knows the truth now too. And if he gets to you first, he'll make sure you never learn anything else. I wanted to scream, to tell him I didn't care. But beneath the fury was a hollow ache. The kind that only comes from realizing that love and hate can occupy the same space without canceling each other out. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You saved my life once. Let me save yours now. I should have said no. I should have told him that saving me didn't erase what he'd done, that no amount of protection could rebuild the trust he'd just burned to ash. But when his hand brushed mine, gentle, almost pleading, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Because even as I hated him, some part of me still recognized him. The broken man beneath the monster. The sinner who had stumbled bleeding into my diner and changed everything with a single word. Fine, I whispered. I'll go. But after that, you'll never see me again. He nodded once, and something in his eyes flickered, the faintest crack in the mask. That's what I'm afraid of. As he turned and walked away, I felt the note in my pocket again, the paper damp against my skin, and realized that Isabella's warning hadn't been about Marco at all. It had been about Adrian. There is a strange quiet that comes when you've cried yourself past the point of sound, when the body understands that no amount of sobbing can rewrite what has already been written, and so it simply stills, emptying itself of resistance, surrendering to the numb ache that takes its place. That was the quiet that followed me through the halls of Adrian Moretti's house that night, the echo of my own exhaustion, the hollowness beneath my ribs, the brittle awareness that something inside me had cracked too deeply to ever fit the same again. Luca appeared at my door a little after midnight, his expression as composed as ever, but his eyes betraying a flicker of discomfort, as if he too could feel the tension humming through the air, like a live wire. It's time, he said, and those two words, so simple, so final, rang like the tolling of a bell. I followed him down the corridor, my steps slow, deliberate, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. My mind was a storm of half-formed thoughts, fragments of what Adrian had said and what he hadn't, of the look on his face when I told him I would leave. He hadn't tried to stop me, hadn't raised his voice or begged, and somehow that calm had cut deeper than rage ever could. It wasn't indifference, it was acceptance, and the knowledge of that terrified me more than any threat. Outside, the night was drenched in mist, the kind that blurs the edges of everything it touches. The gardens glistened faintly under the moonlight, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and roses crushed under boot heels. A black car waited near the gate, engine idling softly, its headlights slicing through the fog. Luca opened the door, gesturing for me to get in. We'll take you to a safe location. Mr. Moretti will meet you there once the situation here is secure. I hesitated, the note in my pocket burning like a secret brand. He already knows. The words had haunted me for hours, threading through every thought, every step, until they had become a rhythm under my skin. Luca, I said quietly, how long have you worked for him? He blinked, caught off guard by the question. A long time. Long enough to trust him? There was a pause, subtle but telling. Long enough to understand him. And what does that mean? He looked at me for a moment, as though weighing what I could handle. It means he doesn't always tell you the truth, but he always believes he's protecting you when he lies. The words settled heavy between us, too close to the fear already coiled in my chest. Before I could respond, he gestured again toward the open door. Please, Elena, we have to go. So I climbed in. The interior smelled of leather and faint smoke, the same scent that clung to Adrian's clothes, and I hated how my body recognized it, how it calmed something inside me even now. The engine's hum was steady, hypnotic, and as the gates of the Moretti estate closed behind us, I felt the finality of it sink into my bones. We drove in silence for a long while. The city slid past in fragments, empty streets, the glow of street lamps smeared by the rain, the occasional shadow of another car following too far behind to be coincidence. Luca's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more than once, and though he said nothing, the tightening of his jaw told me everything. "We're being followed, aren't we?" I asked, my voice too calm for the panic clawing underneath. He didn't answer. "Luca," I pressed. "Is it Marco?" He met my eyes in the mirror. "Yes." The single word detonated quietly between us. "How does he keep finding us?" I whispered, more to myself than him. "Because he's not just looking for you," Luca said grimly. "He's looking for what you represent. The ring, the ledger, everything Adrian built his empire on. You're the last piece." I turned toward the window, my reflection pale against the dark glass. "Then maybe I should stop running and just give him what he wants." "That's not how this works," Luca said. "If he gets you, he won't let you live. Not because of what you know, but because of what you mean to Adrian." The words made my throat tighten. I didn't want to mean anything to him. Not anymore. Not after what I'd learned. But the truth was unavoidable. Meaning had already taken root, and it was far too late to tear it out. The car turned off the main road, the asphalt narrowing into a stretch of woodland, trees crowding close on either side like silent witnesses. I could feel the unease in Luca's posture, the tension threading through his shoulders. "Where are we going?" I asked. "A safe house," he said. "Remote, secure. We'll wait there until Adrian gives word." But something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, hollow. I shifted in my seat, my instincts prickling. "You don't sound convinced." His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. "I trust him," he said finally. "I don't trust what's coming for him." Before I could ask what he meant, the world exploded into motion. The roar of engines behind us shattered the stillness, followed by the flash of headlights cutting through the trees. Another car slammed into us from behind, the impact so violent it threw me forward against the seatbelt, the air punched from my lungs. Luca cursed, swerving hard, tires screaming against the wet road. "Hold on!" he shouted. The next moments blurred into chaos, metal against metal, the shatter of glass, gunfire cracking through the night. Luca drew a weapon from under his jacket and fired out the window, the muzzle flash illuminating his face in brief, sharp bursts. I ducked low, covering my head as shards of glass rained around me. Another impact. The car spun, skidding off the road, the world turning sideways as the trees rushed closer, and then everything went black with the sound of crushing metal and breaking bone. When consciousness returned, it came in pieces. Sound first, a low ringing in my ears, then the taste of blood in my mouth, the smell of smoke. My vision swam as I forced my eyes open. The car was wrecked, tilted on its side, the windshield a spiderweb of cracks. Luca was slumped over the wheel, motionless, his chest rising shallowly but still moving. Relief flickered. He was alive, but it was short-lived, because beyond the twisted frame of the car, I could see the shapes of men approaching through the fog. Their silhouettes tall and deliberate, guns glinting faintly in the moonlight. Panic flared hot and immediate. My seatbelt was jammed, the buckle bent, but adrenaline makes miracles of weakness, and after one desperate pull, it snapped free. I crawled through the shattered window, the glass slicing my palms, the ground slick beneath my feet. The forest loomed around me, thick and endless. But before I could run, a voice cut through the fog, smooth and familiar. "Going somewhere, Angel?" I froze. For a heartbeat, I thought it was Adrian. But it wasn't. The voice was too amused, too venomous. Marco stepped into view, dressed in black, his expression infuriatingly calm, despite the wreckage and the chaos behind him. His gun was pointed lazily at my chest. But it was his eyes. Dark, predatory, that held me captive. "You're really not very good at staying hidden," he said, smiling. "I suppose that's what makes you so interesting." "Stay away from me," I said, though the words came out more as breath than sound. He laughed, the sound low and cold. "You sound just like him when you're angry." "I'm nothing like him." "Oh, but you are," he murmured, stepping closer. "You both think you can fix what's broken. You both mistake loyalty for love. And now look where it's gotten you." I backed away, my hands trembling, the forest floor uneven beneath me. "What do you want?" "The same thing he does," Marco said simply. "The ledger, the ring, the truth. The difference is, I don't pretend it's about saving you." He raised the gun, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, and for a terrible second, I thought it was over, that this was where my story ended, in a forgotten forest between two men who had already ruined me in their own ways. But then a shot rang out. Not from Marco's gun, but from somewhere behind him. He staggered, his expression flickering from arrogance to shock, and fell to one knee. And out of the fog stepped Adrian. He looked like he'd come straight out of hell. Blood on his face, his shirt torn, his eyes burning with a fury so sharp it didn't seem human. His gun was steady, his voice low. "You should have stayed gone, brother." Marco laughed, coughing blood. "You always did love an audience." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Let her go." "She's already yours," Marco said weakly, his grin widening even as he bled. "And that's exactly why you'll lose everything." The next shot silenced him. The forest went still again, the fog swallowing the sound, leaving only the smell of smoke and rain and the echo of what had just happened. Adrian stood over his brother's body for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, like someone who had finally finished a war he'd been fighting his entire life. When he turned to me, his eyes softened, but there was something hollow behind them. He reached out a hand, bloodied and shaking slightly. "Come with me, Elena." I stared at him, my body trembling, my mind caught between hatred and relief. "You killed him," I whispered. "He was already dead," Adrian said quietly. "I just buried what was left." And as the distant wail of sirens began to rise in the distance, slicing through the fog like judgment, I realized that what had just ended here was not the war between brothers, but the beginning of something far more dangerous, something that would demand pieces of both of us before it was through. Sirens sound different when you're the reason they're coming. They don't wail so much as interrogate the air. A spiraling demand threaded through metal and rain and the unsuspecting trees. And as their calls tore the fog into ribbons, I stood between the fallen body of the man who had worn Adrian's face like a fractured mirror, and the living man whose shadow had already lengthened over every corner of my life. And I realized, with a sinking, nauseous certainty that whatever line I had, once believed separated victim from accomplice, had blurred under my feet, until it was only mud, cold, and clinging, and impossible to leave behind without taking half the forest with me. Adrian's hand was still outstretched, blood drying in spiderweb lines across his knuckles and wrist, the muscles in his forearm trembling with a restraint that looked almost like prayer, while his eyes, those fathomless, river-at-midnight eyes, tracked every flicker of my breath as if the next one might decide the shape of his future. And I wanted to say something brutal or clean or at least coherent. I wanted to say that I could not step toward him without stepping onto a path paved with the bones of every version of myself I had promised to protect. But instead I stepped closer to Marco's body, because the dead demand honesty in a way the living only pretend to. And I crouched in the wet leaves and touched the pocket where he had shoved the serpent ring like a crown stolen in a childish game. And I felt the cold press of it against my fingertips, and told myself that if I could just retrieve it, if I could clutch that small, damning circle of metal and secrets, then maybe I could bargain with fate, or at least with the men who thought they were fate's accountants. The sirens grew louder. They were no longer distant rumor, but incoming verdict. And Adrian moved to cover me with his body, in a gesture that felt infuriatingly natural. A shield made of muscle and ruin, and the kind of loyalty that arrives only after everything else has been burned away. And as my fingers slipped inside the soaked fabric and found the ring's edge, I told myself not to flinch at the heat still radiating from a corpse that had been a brother, because whatever mercy remained between these two men had already emptied itself into the ground, into my lungs, into this night that refused to end. When I stood, the ring sat in my palm like a small eclipse, heavy with a gravity out of proportion to its size. The serpent's tiny scales biting into my skin, as if to remind me that circles are prisons too. And Adrian's gaze dropped to it with a hunger he didn't bother to disguise. A hunger that wasn't greed so much as purpose sharpened into need. And he said my name in a voice that had learned to bow only to inevitability. And I found that I could not give it to him. Not yet. Not while Michael's name. My Michael, who had once believed that the world could be repaired with stubborn goodness and a willingness to work late and bring home flowers bought with overtime, was blooming like blood inside the unspoken spaces between us. "Don't," I said, the word barely a thread, the rest of my meaning tied up in the way I didn't step back, in the way I let him see that the tremor in my hand came from fury and not from fear. And he halted as if I'd pressed a blade to the softest part of him, which, God help us both, might have been his faith in my capacity to forgive what should never be forgiven, and he tried to speak. But the forest answered first, the sirens shattering into proximity, the splash of tires on wet dirt, the crackle of radio voices, and the low, purposeful language of men who were about to choose sides. "Some of them are mine," he said, very softly, as if he were apologizing for the weather, "and some are not." And the fact that this could be both reassurance and warning in his mouth made me want to laugh until the laugh turned into something uglier. Because how do you build a future inside a world where the law is a commodity and the price is always your soul? And how do you love a man who learned to count his absolutions in shipments and bodyguards and the number of heartbeats he could keep alive long enough to buy their gratitude? I closed my fingers over the ring and slid it into my pocket. A thief taking back what another thief had stolen. And I said, with a calm that startled even me, that I would go with him if we could leave this place before the headlights crystallized into faces, that I would not be paraded under the floodlights as a prize or a witness or a bargaining chip, that I refused to be the altar where two kingdoms bled themselves for the entertainment of men who loved to talk about justice but only ever married power. And his expression flickered in that haunted way it did when he was calculating every threat in a room and still choosing me. And he nodded once. A general submitting to the terms of a single stubborn civilian because he'd already decided that the war he was willing to lose could not include me. We moved like trespassers through the trees, the fog licking at our calves, Luca's silhouette materializing out of the smoke with a limp and a grimace that told me pain was something he had learned to file alongside paperwork. And he said the Eastern Service Road was clear for maybe 2 minutes, if the men in the second car were who he thought they were. And Adrian answered in a language that carried steel under its vowels, and I didn't need a translation to know that the plan was desperate in the way all good plans are when time has run out and love has finally admitted it is not a strategy. The service road was nothing but puddles and ruts and the smell of oil, yet the air over it felt like a tightrope strung between 2 skyscrapers. And as we ran, I realized, with a clarity that hurt worse than any cut, that I wasn't running from the police or the Russians or even the repercussions of a death in the leaves behind us. I was running from the decision pressed like a coin under my tongue, the decision to either damn the man beside me with the ring in my pocket or to scorch my own last belief in goodness by choosing him. And I wondered if women in old stories had ever resented the gods for making their virtues and their desires such violent enemies of each other. The first set of headlights tore the dark wide open, tall beams searching, voices calling, and Adrian dragged me behind the cracked concrete lip of a maintenance trench, his body braced over mine in a stance that felt less like a shield now and more like a confession. Because he didn't ask if I would crouch, didn't order obedience. He simply offered his life as the barricade against mine. And for one suspended second, the air between our mouths tasted like the thing no one had yet named. The thing that would either save us or ruin us or both. Until tires screamed farther down the road and Luca hissed a count and we moved again. Up and over and across into the gullet of the trees. When we crashed through a last curtain of saplings and fell gasping into a clearing. A black SUV sat crouched like a predator at rest, engine faintly ticking. Doors unlocked by some ghost hand who'd been listening for our footfalls, and I wanted to ask who had placed it there. Which of Adrian's ghosts on the city payroll had smoothed our path? But questions were luxuries we could no longer spend. So we slid inside, Luca in front with his jaw set, and his shoulders soaked dark. Adrian beside me with his palm open on the seat between us like an oath he didn't dare speak aloud, and the vehicle shot forward into a tunnel of wet branches and swallowed us whole. The city found us again the way cities always do, not with welcome but with appetite. Large roads drinking us back into their veins, neon smearing across the windshield like bruised light. River bridges lifting and dropping away beneath the tires. And as the sirens thinned behind us, and the map in Luca's head replaced the map in the sky, Adrian finally turned, his voice low enough that it seemed to move under my skin rather than through the air. And he said that the ledger inside the ring could be unlocked in only one place now. That the off-site server farm he had built under a fake utility company was the last door Marco didn't know how to open. And if we could get there before dawn, then the city's names, all of them, even the ones that glowed like monuments and the ones that hid like rats, would either burn or be reborn. And I felt a terrible, exhilarating steadiness come over me because I knew then that whatever else I was, I wanted to be present at the moment the truth rose like a flood. I told him I would go as far as the server doors. I told him I would stand beside him until the serpent uncoiled its secrets and the banks began to cough up their ghosts. And I told him, because I needed to own the shape of my own weakness, that when the data spat out the name tied to the explosion that had eaten Michael's future, I would not be his lover. I would be his judge. And he bowed his head. Not in surrender, but in acceptance of a justice he had earned 10 times over. And in that small, grave motion I recognized a kind of courage I had not expected to find in a man like him. The courage to offer your throat to the person you most wanted to keep. The compound rose out of the industrial dark, like a myth pretending to be a substation. Cyclone fence glittering with dew. Cameras winking. A roll-up door yawning after a code Luca tapped with shaking fingers, and inside the air tasted like cold metal and steady electricity. A hive built by men who worshipped continuity more than law. Aisles of server racks blinking their indifferent constellations, while the floor hummed like a restrained storm. And for a moment I loved the room the way people love cathedrals. Not for God, but for the way they make you feel like a mortal worthy of scale. Adrian moved with the competence of a man who organizes chaos for sport. Hands dancing across consoles and security panels, breath measured, eyes gone flint hard, while Luca posted himself like a cracked statue near the entrance, and I stood before a terminal that reflected my face in blue and white, and thought of all the nights I had stitched men back together in fluorescent rooms where no one knew my last name, and how those simple resurrections had felt like salvation until I learned there were empires built on keeping the wounded alive long enough to pay their debts. When the prompt demanded the key, I slid the ring from my pocket, its weight suddenly more intimate than my own heartbeat. And I hesitated, not because I doubted the choice to reveal what had been hidden, but because I understood that once the serpent opened its mouth, there would be no closing it again, no pretending that my hands were clean, or my love was theoretical. And I lifted my eyes to Adrian's and asked, in a voice that tried for steady and nearly got there, whether he was ready to lose everything that had made him. And he answered without looking away that he had already lost the only thing he hadn't expected to, and that whatever came next would either return it to him or take him with it. And I swallowed the ache that sentence placed in my chest and seated the ring into the reader's cradle. The system woke like something ancient roused by a spell. A cascade of commands. A choreography of light. Encrypted vaults yawning open in digits and whispers, and the screens filled with names, some expected, some unthinkable. Arteries of money, dates like scars, memos that read like epitaphs, and then, as the index raced toward the letter M, I felt my throat close because I knew before I saw it that his name would be there. Not Adrian's. No, Michael's. And that beside it there would be a reference code linking to a transaction tagged with a job number and a subcontractor and some banal euphemism for what had been fire. And when it arrived, it was like being struck quietly by lightning. Not pain first, but comprehension. My fiancé reduced to a line item paid in full. I didn't cry. The servers were crying for me, their fans sighing like wind through pines, and the sound steadied me just enough to see the second thing the screen offered. A secondary ledger entry routed to a charity with my hospital's name on it, the money coming from a shell woven through 3 banks, and ending in a note that read, "Compensation per instruction." And I turned to Adrian with the taste of iron rising in my mouth and said, in a voice as even as a condemned woman's last words, that he had known enough to send atonement even if he hadn't been brave enough to send truth. He stepped toward me. Something devastated and ferocious mingled on his face. Hands open like a man approaching a skittish animal he loves and has already mortally wounded. And he said that he was ready now, that if I wanted his life, I could take it. That if I wanted the city, I could break it. That if I wanted him to walk into the morning and never turn around, he would do it without flinching, so long as I believed the world would be safer in his absence. And I felt the gun in my pocket like a pulse I didn't remember putting there. I felt the ledger dancing like a serpent under glass. I felt the first splintering thud against the outer door as men who didn't care about love or justice arrived to reclaim the dark. Luca shouted from the entryway that we had company. Too many. Wrong badges and dead eyes. Russians and bought uniforms and the kind of mercenaries who enjoyed their work. And the door groaned again. A hinge screaming. The world tilting toward violence. And in the humming light of the server room I lifted the gun, not with a flourish, but with the terrible steadiness of a person who has finally admitted that choices are knives, and I leveled it at the only heart that had ever asked to be pierced by me and me alone, and I said his name once, only once, because if I said it twice I would put the weapon down and kiss him instead. And his eyes didn't close and his hands didn't rise. He only nodded as if I'd finally arrived where he'd been waiting, somewhere between verdict and vow. And the door behind us blew inward in a howl of splinters and steel. I tightened my finger on the trigger, the room filling with armed men and electric light, and a storm of shouted orders, and in the instant before the shot that would make me murderer or savior, a familiar, serpent-etched drone in the console changed pitch. A silent alarm went live on a dozen screens, and my eyes dropped for a heartbeat, just one, to the last line the ledger had unlocked. A name I knew, a name higher than either of us, a name that meant the city itself had been buying our graves. And I understood with the force of revelation that the person standing behind the men with guns, the one we'd never suspected because we'd been too busy hating each other, was the one who had ordered Michael's death and financed both brothers' war, and that they were here now in the flesh, stepping through the smoke with a smile like a coronation. "Hello, Elena," the patron saint of corruption said pleasantly as the muzzles swung. "Shall we finish what we started?" And my finger broke the last thin boundary between thought and action as the world became light and thunder, and the choice I had refused to make chose me. When the shot rang out, it was as if the world fractured in half. The part that had existed before I pulled the trigger, and the part that could never go back again. And in that impossible space between them, sound became a memory. Light became liquid. And I felt the recoil not just in my hands, but in every bone that had ever dared to believe in mercy. Time slowed to something viscous, surreal, like honey poured over glass. The muzzle flash bloomed like a second sun. The men shouting dissolved into a blur of faces and smoke. And all I could see was Adrian. Not falling, not dying, but stepping through the echo of the bullet like a man walking through his own absolution. his body folding around mine in one final instinctive act of protection, and the heat of him, the weight, the blood. God, the blood rushed against me in waves I couldn't tell apart from my own heartbeat. The room erupted into chaos, gunfire and sparks and the shriek of metal. And somewhere beneath it all, the servers kept humming, still dutifully displaying their unholy scripture of numbers and names, indifferent to the men dying in front of them. Luca's voice barked commands that dissolved into the roar, and I remember his hand, rough and shaking, dragging me backward through the storm of bullets, his body shielding mine just as Adrian's had. His breath ragged with the kind of pain that made words unnecessary. I wanted to go to Adrian, to reach him, to see his face, to tell him that it wasn't supposed to end like this, that I hadn't meant for redemption to come at the cost of blood. But there was no room left for language, only the instinct to survive. We crashed through a side door and stumbled into the night. The industrial yard lit by the red pulse of fire alarms and the distant wail of approaching sirens, and the air burned with the metallic taste of ozone and betrayal. My hands were trembling, slick with blood that wasn't all. Mine and the ring, the serpent, was gone, lost somewhere in the storm of violence, swallowed by the very empire it had been built to expose. Luca's shoulder was slick and dark, but he kept moving, kept pulling me toward the fence, toward some imagined safety on the other side. The world around us felt fragile, unreal, like a set that would collapse the moment we stopped pretending it was real. Behind us, the explosion came. Not the cinematic roar of destruction, but a deep, hollow concussion that felt like the earth exhaling after holding its breath too long. The facility went up in flames, orange and white, the heat chasing us like an animal made of hunger and retribution. I turned once, only once, and through the thick smoke I thought I saw him, Adrian, standing for a heartbeat in the glow. Backlit by the inferno, his silhouette steady, almost peaceful, before the collapsing ceiling swallowed the image and replaced it with fire. I don't remember how we got out after that. Maybe Luca carried me. Maybe I stumbled after him on instinct alone. I remember the cold slap of air when we broke past the fence, the wet earth beneath my palms when I fell to my knees, the distant noise of helicopters circling above like vultures too civilized to land. I remember whispering his name until it stopped sounding like a word and became a prayer. Days passed, or maybe only hours, the timeline fractured like everything else. Luca and I hid in the kind of forgotten motel that looks like it has been waiting all its life for people like us, people with blood on their clothes and ghosts in their eyes. He patched his wound in silence, and I sat by the window, staring at the empty road that led nowhere, waiting for a car that would never come. The television in the corner murmured about the fire, the mysterious explosion, the dozens of men found dead, the police investigation that was already being buried under bureaucracy and bribes. There was no mention of Adrian Moretti. There never would be. Men like him don't die in news stories. They die in whispers, in the spaces between power and grief. When dawn finally came, it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the aftermath of a confession I hadn't chosen to make. The light was pale, almost colorless, washing the world clean in a way that felt cruel. I took one of Luca's cigarettes even though I didn't smoke, lit it, and watched the smoke curl upward until it vanished into the cracked ceiling. He didn't speak, didn't ask what I was thinking, because he already knew. That I was turning over every moment in my mind, searching for a way to rewrite it, to make a different choice in that server room, to have found a way to save him without killing something essential inside myself. But guilt is a parasite that doesn't starve. It feeds on memory. And I realized that even if I could go back, I would still pull the trigger, because some endings are written in the marrow long before you recognize them.